All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and as promised, we are back with Days of Future Past, Doomsday, the conclusion of the story, and the eradication of the mutant population on Earth. Now, what this does here, right, for those of you guys who are just now picking up, at the end of this video, I'll have a link to a playlist where you can catch the first video that we did that kind of ran over everything. But in effect, we're at year 33. 33 years after the assassination of Senator Robert Kelly, the reactivation of the Sentinel program, which basically became self-aware, and Sentinels taking over North America and enslaving the mutant and human population. And so what happened is that somewhere along the line, basically in what was formerly Asteroid N, which was at one point a base of operations for Magneto, that it has now become a prison for the mutant population. Now that's one of the big differences between the original Days of Future Past and this one. And the original Days of Future Past, and in fact, we'll actually get to that point in the story, that main internment camp was actually in New York, right? But what ended up going on here is that when the Sentinels first started capturing mutants and they set up this internment camp, that what they did is they created a kind of central hub, right? A kind of mainframe computer. And that computer controlled the inhibitor collars that all the mutants wore, right? The collars that basically shut their powers down. Some kind of a riot took place where the mutants were able to destroy the central computer, they reactivated their powers, and they went to war against the Sentinels. And for a moment, they were winning. For a moment, they were winning, and it looked like the day was saved. But then reinforcements arrived. Now, this is another big difference, right? In this moment, what you see here is a combination of Mark I and Mark II Sentinels along with Nimrods. Now, the big difference between the original Days of Future Past and this Days of Future Past is that in the original story, the reason why the Sentinels were able to take over North America and really wipe out most of the superhero community is because there were just so many of them, right? Like they just multiplied like crazy. So there were thousands, tens of thousands of Sentinels traveling around North America. So any attempt by any remaining members of the superhuman or even human population that tried to fight Sentinels found themselves in a war of attrition. The Sentinels would just keep coming and coming and coming. Eventually, these guys would be worn down and they would either be captured or killed. The Nimrod Sentinels didn't appear until much later on in the Days of Future Past universe. We didn't figure that out until the story Days of Future Present, which we'll talk about a little bit as we get towards the end of this because it's really cool. The important thing here is that there were seemingly only 2 mutants left alive in this riot. The first one was Laura Kinney, X-23, who pretty much all of you guys know about, and the other one was Sync, right? Everett Thomas. Now, Everett Thomas has grown more popular, at least in more recent years, since Jonathan Hickman's reworking of the X-Men mythos, but this guy is ridiculously overpowered, especially now because his powers have evolved. But in essence, he can duplicate the powers of anybody who's near him. A great big caveat that was adjusted, or kind of a boost to his power that was given recently, is that there's no limit to how long he can hold on to that power for. So he could walk through like a field of mutants, copy all their abilities, and then hold on to those powers seemingly for the rest of his life. So the guys like Peter Petrelli from Heroes back in the day, if you guys remember that show. And so this whole event is actually told to Franklin Richards, Magneto, Storm, Rachel Summers, Colossus. It's told to them by Kitty Pryde. She's kind of hearing it all, or at least repeating it all to them, because she heard it secondhand. It just happened over there off the coast of San Francisco. Nobody really knows for sure who survived or anything. But following that whole event, that's when you start to fall more in line with the traditional Days of Future Past story, where each one of the mutants had an inhibitor collar that had to be turned off individually. So there was no mainframe to destroy. The only way to get your powers back was to destroy your own inhibitor collar. But if you did that, it would detonate and it would kill you. So just because of the fact that none of the mutants wanted to die, they were stuck with really these inhibitor collars around their necks. And so what's going on here is really kind of like this dovetail into the original conclusion of Days of Future Past, where Kitty Pryde, if you recall in the previous video, and again, you'll find a link to that playlist at the end of this video, Kitty Pryde had come across Bishop. Now, Bishop, traditionally a time-traveling mutant, did not appear in the original Days of Future Past because he was not introduced in Marvel at that point in time, right? He wasn't introduced in Marvel until, what is it, Uncanny X-Men 286, 289, maybe it was 287, something like that. But he was introduced much later on, right, in the 80s, late 80s, going into the early 90s. But the kicker about all this is that Bishop had told Kitty Pryde, you guys need to find a way to time travel. It's the only way for you to save your current universe. Now, before a lot of you guys kind of get dismissive and you're like, oh my God, really, time travel hijinks? Don't worry, Marvel does not disappoint. They do not disappoint. And in fact, the ending to this is not like the original Days of Future Past. That's the one hint I'll give you. And so what this does is this transitions over to the Atlantic Ocean. And the reason why is because in order for this plan to work, these remaining X-Men, right, Kitty Pryde and everybody else, they need to be able to deactivate their inhibitor collars. But Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four is dead. He was killed in the last video. Iron Man was killed in the last video. There's no one out there, right? Hank Pym, Ant-Man, all these guys, Bruce Banner, there's nobody else out there with the level of wherewithal and the technological prowess to deactivate these collars, except for one guy, Forge. Now, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with Forge, and I imagine there's probably a few people who are not, Forge is basically a mutant whose power basically turns him into Tony Stark. That's really what it is. If you take away his mutant power, he doesn't really know how to do anything. But with his mutant power, he's just this genius technological inventor. But because of his capabilities, the Sentinels didn't kill him. Instead, they've been using him as a guy that can help them advance their own machinery and advance their own capabilities. Now, this is also another big difference between the original Days of Future Past. If this was part of that story, it was never readily explained in Chris Claremont's original run in Uncanny X-Men 141 and 142. The only thing we really knew is that because the Sentinels were technologically advanced and because they were self-aware, they took over the Baxter Building, the former home base of the Fantastic Four, and they used all the technology in the Baxter Building to enhance themselves. But because they were just machines, right, they were like the machines from the Matrix, right? Like the longer they existed, the more advanced they became just by understanding their own components and evolving from there, right? Self-aware and autonomous. So it is a kind of cool little addition to this, but because Forge is so necessary here, word had been sent to Wolverine, who's part of the Canadian Resistance, which is an accurate part of the original Days of Future Past, and that the idea here is that he would basically sneak in and he would get Forge out. Now, the reason why this works both in the original and in this one is because it's Wolverine, right? Marvel is actually building off Daniel Way's Wolverine Origins run. That's how this works. If you guys aren't familiar with that, Wolverine Origins by Daniel Way was the story where Wolverine got all of his memories back after the events of House of M. And so he went on this kind of like warpath. But one of the things that he had done is he had successfully snuck into the White House and then eventually left and did it without being caught. And so the guy can get in and out of basically anywhere. But once he gets in here, because Sentinels are not like humans, meaning there's very, very little that they ever actually miss, Wolverine gets Forge. He basically helps him at least to try to initiate the escape. But he tells him getting in is not the problem. It's getting out. Now, you would think a way in is a way out, but whatever means he used to get in here is seemingly not available to him as they're trying to leave. But the Nimrods immediately pick up on what it is that these guys are doing, right? That they're here and they're trying to stage an escape. And so because of the fact that there's really no way out for both of them, Forge does the only thing he can do, right? He says, I'll stay behind to destroy this terminal so the Sentinels will not know what I've designed, and then I'll cover your escape. Now, here's the kicker behind this. Forge has been working on more than simply just a way to deactivate inhibitor collars. He's been working on a kind of technology that would actually allow the entirety of the remaining mutant population to escape their confinement and wage war against the Sentinels. But here's the caveat to this. There's a ticking time bomb here. Quite literally, the rest of the world has come to the realization of the threat that the Sentinels pose. Because remember, what we covered in the last video is that despite the fact that Sentinels were activated by humans to track down mutants and to basically capture them in North America, the Sentinels rationalized with the only real logic that they could use that because mutants were the next stage in human evolution, mutants are humans. And so Sentinels tracked down both, and they took over the entirety of North America. The rest of the world, right, especially Europe, came to the realization if the Sentinels escape North America and they're able to impose their will across the rest of the world, everybody will be captured. Every single human, every single superpowered being, the whole 9 yards. So what the rest of the world is currently planning is a nuclear strike against North America to eradicate the entirety of the Sentinel population, which would happen. right, they would be able to destroy pretty much all Sentinels. And even if they didn't destroy all the Sentinels, they would wipe out enough that their numbers would count for nothing. So it's one of those really like, okay, we have only so long to do this. And so one of the things that goes on here is that the Sentinels themselves, what they've been doing is that because they had become more advanced as time had gone on, that they had basically become larger and larger. And because of that, there were certain tasks that they simply just were not fit to do. They couldn't really go out there into the world and scavenge for parts anymore to grab resources and things that were needed for Forge to do his work or whatever else. And so what they were doing is they were grabbing mutants and they were sending them out and saying, get these components, get what we need, and then come back, right? If you don't, if you're not back within 3 hours, we'll activate your inhibitor collars and we'll kill you, right? That's basically it. And so the mutants were more like, right, errand boys, errand girls, that's really the purpose that they served. But what the Sentinels didn't realize is that this offered the mutant population this kind of unsupervised time where they can actually actively work against the Sentinels themselves. Now, one of the things that's kind of cool here is that it almost gives the Sentinels this air of arrogance, right? Like, who are these mutants to believe they could overtake us? And in fact, that's accurate, right? In the original Days of Future Past and in this one, as the Sentinels become more self-aware, they begin to develop almost human emotions. They become arrogant, right? That's kind of how they began to evolve and began to grow. And so what they end up doing is Kitty Pryde meets with Wolverine. He passes the thumb drive off to her, and the project, or what it was that Forge was working on, was basically a jammer. So instead of simply just shutting down an inhibitor collar, that this jammer would be able to shut down multiple collars at once, which is a far more productive method of allowing mutants the ability to use their powers. Because instead of like running around with a little key, right, and like trying to make contact with 50 little mutants and trying to turn off their inhibitor collars and so on, they just take this thing, sit it down, turn it on, and everybody can use their powers now, right? In one fell swoop, the entirety of the mutant population goes back to the way they were without having to worry about the inability to being able to use their abilities against the Sentinels. And so this is when they really start to get into the realm of time travel, because much like the original Days of Future Past story, because Rachel Summers is the daughter of Cyclops and Jean Grey in Days of Future Past, she has vast telepathic powers. And in fact, this kind of brings in, right, really kind of dovetails nicely into Days of Future Present. Days of Future Present, while it's not part of this story, it seemingly leads into it, but Days of Future Present was a story that was told in Marvel Comics back in the 80s that basically explained how it was that Rachel Summers arrived in the main Marvel universe. And we'll talk about that a little more as we get towards the end of this, because you guys are going to kind of find yourselves in a sort of precarious position. I'm curious to see how you guys respond to it if you never read the original Days of Future Past. But this whole plan, this was the idea of Bishop, right? It was like Bishop's idea. Have someone send your mind into the past, into the younger body of yourself. Because if your physical body goes back there, you could get stuck. Any number of things could go wrong. But by sending your mind into the past, especially with like a telepath like Rachel Summers, she serves as an anchor. She can yank you back, right? It's a tether, that kind of thing. And so Kitty Pryde's mind goes into the body of her younger self. And for those of you guys who read the original Days of Future Past, this is all familiar to you. So I'm going to cover this more for the people who never read the original story, so you're not left hanging, because it's a landmark story, the most iconic X-Men story ever told. Honestly, I think it's better than the Dark Phoenix saga, if I'm being quite frank with you guys. But that's because I love it when there's like death, pandemonium, and the end of times in Marvel Comics, when everybody dies. I love those stories. And so Kitty Pryde's mind going into the body of her younger self when she was like, what, like 15, I think it was, maybe like 12 or 13 when she first joined the X-Men, she's able to stop the assassination of Senator Robert Kelly. And as soon as that happens, her mind is yanked back. And so one of the things that is a little bit different here is that unlike the original Days of Future Past, where she goes back and kind of meets with the X-Men and gets to know them and all that kind of stuff, you get that to a degree here, but it's kind of passed over super fast. And I think a lot of that is because Marvel's kind of relying on people to understand the original Days of Future Past. All that really means here is that when Kitty's mind went back into the past in the original Days of Future Past story, that she actually spent a few days, like a week or so, with the X-Men, basically saying, hey, this is going to happen at this point in time here in a little while. you guys need to be prepared for it, right? She actually spent time, learned about the X-Men, different things along those lines, and then took those lessons back with her into the future. And that's exactly what happens here. But there was also a plan B, because there was no guarantee that her going into the past and changing it would change the future. And we'll talk about why that matters here in a second, because Marvel invokes branch universe theory both in the original Days of Future Past and in this one. And so what happens as part of this plan B is that with the inhibitor collars deactivated by way of the jammer, it allows them to remove the inhibitor collars proper and then stage their attempt escape against the Sentinels. Now, much like the original Days of Future Past, basically everybody dies, right? Like Storm is able to help them stave off the Sentinels for a little while. Magneto stays behind in his wheelchair to basically cover their escape, right? Like it's one of those things where they're kind of like, I mean, look, his wheelchair would have slowed us down. He made the right call to stay behind, right? The Sentinels come out of nowhere. They annihilate Franklin Richards. Here's a big kicker, because this is something that a lot of people asked about with Franklin Richards in the original Days of Future Past and the stories that came after. Because one of the things that a lot of people don't know about Franklin is that with Days of Future Past, he was just introduced as the son of Reed and Susan. But his whole like crazy level reality warping powers, right, that wasn't until much later on. So a lot of people ask the question, if Franklin Richards, by virtue of the establishment of his reality warping powers when he was an adult, if he was so incredibly powerful, why is it he was destroyed by the Sentinels? The only real explanation Marvel and even us as the fan base were able to offer was twofold. Either one, in this universe, he never attained that level of power. He never really became this crazy reality warping character. Or if he did, none of the events transpired in his history that led to him realizing he had that power, right? So the old Fantastic Four story, when he was frustrated working with a Rubik's Cube and aged himself up into an adult, what is it, Fantastic Four 145 or 146, something like that? That story never happened, right? So like he never realized he could alter reality. None of those things took place. The Abraxas saga never took place. Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers never took place, right? Because most of the superheroes were dead by that point. And so again, it's one of these things where he was a telepath and telekinetic, but that was basically it. He didn't have his crazy reality warping powers. But the long and short of this is that this guy's destroyed, right? So two of them are down. Rachel Summers, being the love interest of Franklin, she kind of stays behind a little bit, right? And just kind of continues to attack the Sentinels using a combination of her telepathy and telekinesis, which creates a kind of psionic blast that just blows the head off of one of these Sentinels. But again, their goal is to basically keep moving forward, is to find a way to attack the Sentinels' main base of operations, i.e. the Baxter Building. And so as they get there, much like the original Days of Future Past, right, Wolverine, as soon as he enters into the Baxter Building, one of the Sentinels immediately attacks him. And that's because they knew they were coming, right? The Sentinels were well aware of the fact that they were coming. Now, what really went on here is that Wolverine and those guys ended up tripping a sensor, right, that really alerted the Sentinels to their presence, and the Sentinels just incinerated Wolverine on the spot. Now, this is one of the other things about Days of Future Past. When the story was originally done, and what this story is really kind of building on, is the fact that Wolverine's healing factor had not become what it is now. Back during the days of Chris Claremont's X-Men, Wolverine's healing factor was more practical than anything else, right? It wasn't like it is in Civil War, where his whole body's annihilated and he just heals, right? And then like that's it, and his healing factor becomes like a plot device to a story. No. It was a fairly reasonable healing factor. And so that's why in this story, he's incinerated entirely and he doesn't heal back from it, right? He's incinerated all the way down to his adamantium skeleton. It's not to the point where it's like, well, all you need is a cell and then he'll heal back from everything. No, it's not like that anymore. Of course, Storm launches an attack, Storm's impaled with a spear, and then Colossus goes to make an attack on one of the Sentinels. Now, unlike the original Days of Future Past, where all you see with Colossus is that he goes to attack one of the Sentinels and he's seemingly killed and thrown out of a window, this is where things begin to shift. Because unlike the original Days of Future Past, where it's the end of times for everybody, Magneto survived. Magneto made it out against those 4 Sentinels. And why wouldn't he? Right? And I think that's one of the best decisions about this, is because, like, sure, Magneto's older, but like 4 Sentinels? No, man, like 4 Sentinels are not enough power to take out the master of magnetism, right? Like their entire body is composed of an element he can use as a weapon, like literally metal. They are their own destruction in the eyes of Magneto. So that guy took out those 4 Sentinels. He arrives on the scene And then he goes after these 4 Sentinels. And in fact, he seemingly seems to issue kind of like an EMP to a degree. But one of the Sentinels, which is basically in the process of failing and deactivating, grabs Colossus and then squeezes him to the point where his body basically just crushes. Now, that is one of the things to understand about Colossus. His organic metal skin is actually called osmium. It is not indestructible. It's not like adamantium or vibranium or something along those lines. It is highly resistant to extreme high and extremely low temperatures, but given the nature of the Sentinels, the strength that they possess in an effort to basically take out guys like the Incredible Hulk and people like that, sure, they were able to destroy this guy's body pretty well. But that's when Kitty Pryde wakes up, and ultimately it comes to this realization, nothing in the future has changed. Now, that's where the original Days of Future Present came into play, because the belief with the original Days of Future Past is that by stopping the assassination in the past, everything in the future would just cease to exist. Much like the movie, right? Like, if you guys remember in the movie that Wolverine succeeded, that the assassination was stopped, and everybody just vanished, right? And everything just went back as if it never had hit. Like, it was like that future never happened. That's not how it exists here. The argument that Marvel created here is they said, okay, in order to avoid a paradox, it doesn't make any sense logically for the X-Men to go to the past and stop the assassination that creates the future that they just came from. It doesn't make any sense. How do you square that circle? It's going to leave people baffled and nonsensical. So what Marvel does is they create a branch universe. They say, in order for the entire reason for Kitty Pryde to go into the past to even exist in the first place, that future has to exist. Days of Future Past has to exist. And so what that meant is that by stopping the assassination, the guaranteed future of the main Marvel universe is no longer Days of Future Past. Right now, it's just whatever form that future takes based on whatever things transpire over the course of the main Marvel universe's timeline. Days of Future Past is now an alternate reality. It's now a what if. What if the assassination had gone through and no one had been there to stop it? That becomes Days of Future Past. That's how that works when it comes to branch universe in Marvel. And so because of this, they are basically now living in an alternate reality. And because of that, their effort is to find a way to just like stop and annihilate the entirety of the Sentinel forces. Because if they don't, Europe and the rest of the world will nuke North America. And so as they go on this mission, they end up tracking down what's called the High Sentinel Trinity. Basically, these 3 Sentinels that govern everything. Now, that is also a big difference. It wasn't necessarily established at that point in time in the original Days of Future Past, but you ended up learning about a Sentinel called Master Mold. This Sentinel that creates other Sentinels. Kind of a funny little tidbit here. There was a story in the 1990s called Operation Zero Tolerance, where you basically ended up coming across a guy named Bastion, who was the result of the Nimrod Sentinel from Days of Future Past traveling to the present and merging with Master Mold in the present day and creating a whole new guy. Operation Zero Tolerance was dope. That was really good. It was almost as good as Extinction Agenda, right? It was a really good. The 90s were a great time to read X-Men, to be honest with you guys. We need to cover like X-Men in the 90s. That's what we need to do. 90s X-Men comics. It was a great time. And so what this does is it basically leads to the Resistance Force making its move. The cool thing is we have Magneto, we've got Rachel Summers in her traditional outfit, right? Black with the ponytail, the whole 9 yards, the one that she's the most synonymous with from like her original appearances. Bishop is here, of course, alongside Kitty Pryde. And then we also find out that Synch and Laura Kinney both survive. And these guys race into this conflict against the Sentinels in order to destroy them. But we don't find out what happens because that's the end of the story. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. If you need to get caught up, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. It's one crazy cliffhanger, isn't it? Peace.